First introduced in 1996, Chris Redfield has been the OG in the Resident Evil franchise for over 20 years. He's lost friends, faced horrors beyond imagination, and somehow, throughout it all, he just keeps coming back for more. This guy is what you would call a full-blown survival legend. We've seen him evolve from a rookie soldier to a bioweapon specialist. This guy has punched, shot, and quite literally knocked his way through some of the deadliest threats in the Resident Evil universe. How did he get here? What shaped him into the absolute tank of a hero we know today? Well, that's exactly what we're breaking down. Chris Redfield's entire life story. We're covering everything from his first encounter with zombies to his war against bioterrorism, so sit back and relax because this is going to be a hell of a ride. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we have a very small request for our viewers. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Who is Chris Redfield? Chris Redfield isn't your regular action hero. This guy has spent his decades turning bioterror nightmares into pulp. There have been many different versions of him over the years. A S.T.A.R.S officer, a BSAA captain, and a full-time menace to anything even remotely related to the Umbrella Corporation. Chris has been on the front lines of the Resident Evil franchise since day one. Back in 1996, he was just a skilled marksman and a pilot trying to survive a mansion filled with zombies. Fast forward a few decades and he turned into an unstoppable force who single-handedly took on bioweapons, crime syndicates, and whatever fresh nightmare threatened global security. His entire career was shaped by his first encounter with Umbrella, which pushed him to dedicate his life to eradicating bioorganic weapons and hunting down those who would create them. He also has a younger sister, Claire Redfield, who gets wrapped up in her own battles against bioterrorism. And when Chris isn't busy saving the world, he's going toe-to-toe with whatever new abomination science has cooked up. The guy can't catch a damn break, but even through all the hell, there's one thing for sure. If there's a bioweapon on the loose, Chris Redfield is coming for it. History of Chris Redfield. Not much is known about his background, but we do know a few things. Before he was a battle-hardened soldier, Chris Redfield was a regular guy with a knack for survival and a protective streak when it came to his younger sister. Since there's no mention of their parents in the Resident Evil lore, we can assume that Chris and Claire grew up together without them, which may imply that they're both orphans and were forced to fend for themselves. Perhaps this is what shaped him into a fiercely independent and disciplined man, which is kinda commendable. With his innate desire to protect, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force at a young age where he learned combat, piloting, and marksmanship. In a very short time, he proved himself to be a skilled man in all three subjects. However, despite his talent, Chris's strong-willed nature often made him lock horns with his superiors. You see, our guy was never one to just nod and follow the orders blindly, especially if they didn't make sense. That mindset made him a fantastic soldier, but also a nightmare for anyone trying to keep him in line. While most recruits worked their way up by keeping their heads down and obeying commands, Chris chose a different path. One particular incident stands out when, during a routine training exercise, Chris and his squad were ordered to perform a mission drill that, to him, seemed like a total disaster waiting to happen. The plan had too much reliance on bad intel and a serious risk to his team's safety. Chris, being Chris, voiced his concerns, loudly. His superior officer shut him down immediately by telling him to stick his head in the sand and follow orders, but Chris really didn't back down. In fact, he took the liberty to adjust the plan on the fly by prioritizing the safety of his squad while still completing the objective, and the plan worked. The team got through it without a single casualty, making the mission more successful than the original plan, but instead of getting a pat on the back, Chris got a lecture about following orders. The higher-ups outright termed him as insubordinate. Technically, they weren't wrong because this wasn't a one-time thing either. Again and again, Chris found himself butting heads with his superiors when lives were on the line. Eventually, it became clear that Chris was too much of a wild card for the rigid structure of the Air Force. Now, he either resigned or was quietly discharged, depending on who you ask. But instead of sulking, he found a new calling, something that suited him far better. The S.T.A.R.S, short for Special Tactics and Rescue Service. Now, this place was indeed special because they didn't just breed regular soldiers. People here have to fight for something far bigger than corrupt military officials. They have to fight bioterrorism itself. Let's take a look at some of the major Resident Evil franchises with our man, Chris Redfield. Resident Evil 1996. The nightmare begins. After experiencing military discipline and some bureaucratic nonsense, Chris Redfield thought he had seen it all. But little did he know this was just the beginning. Nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face in the Arklay Mountains. It all started when the Bravo team of the Raccoon City Special Tactics and Rescue Service was sent to the outskirts of Raccoon City to investigate a recent string of cannibal murders, and man, they were gruesome. People were being ripped apart in ways that made no sense. The initial thought was that it must be a wild animal, but since there were no known predators in the area that could do something like this, they even thought it must have been a satanic cult, mutilating people for sacrifices. But since they didn't find any witnesses, everything was just a theory. The Raccoon City Police Department was finally at a loss for words and sent in for the S.T.A.R.S. Thus, Chris, along with his Alpha team, i.e. Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Albert Wesker, and a few others, were dispatched to investigate. But from the moment they set foot in the Arklay Forest, everything went south. They found the remains of their comrades from Bravo team, and before they could process what had happened, a bunch of rabid, bloodthirsty dogs attacked them. These creatures looked like they had crawled straight out of hell. In the chaos, Chris and the others fled into a nearby mansion, which would later be known as the Spencer Mansion. At first glance, it seemed like just another creepy mansion in the woods, but as soon as the doors shut behind them, they realized the nightmare was only beginning. Chris had always been good under pressure, but this was next level. As he navigated the corridors, he quickly realized that something was very, very wrong. The mansion was filled with traps, puzzles, and worst of all, creatures that shouldn't exist. They faced zombies, actual flesh-eating zombies. Chris barely had time to process that before he was fighting for his life with them, with whatever he could find. Every room in the mansion held new horrors, like giant snakes, mutant spiders, and the infamous hunters. Thank God Chris wasn't alone through all of it. Looking back, this particular night really cemented his strongest relationships, starting with Jill Valentine. He'd worked with Jill before, but surviving this together created an unbreakable bond. Jill was smart, resourceful, and could hold her own in a fight. They had each other's backs every step of the way, and thus she became family. Then there was Barry Burton, the grizzled veteran of S.T.A.R.S. He looked tough, but he had a big heart. Barry was one of the few people Chris could trust in that mansion, even when it seemed like everyone had an agenda. It was Barry's devotion to his family that reminded Chris why he was fighting. And of course, there was Albert Wesker, the man who he initially thought was their leader, but that trust was about to be shattered. Albert had been playing them from the start. He was a double agent working for the Umbrella Corporation, which was the pharmaceutical company behind all these bioweapon experiments. Albert's real purpose was to collect data on how well Umbrella's bioweapons, like the zombies or the Tyrant, performed in real combat. For Chris, this was now personal. Even though the Tyrant had an unsettling amount of strength and an alarming intelligence, Chris had to take care of him. Wesker released it, thinking he could use it to overpower the group, but the Tyrant had other plans. Chris, alongside Jill and the remaining survivors, faced the Tyrant head-on in a brutal battle, with using every last ounce of strength and every bullet left in their arsenal, eventually taking the monster down. But as the mansion's self-destruct sequence activated, because of course there's a self-destruct button, Chris and his team made a desperate escape and managed to flee, leaving the entire facility reduced to dust. But escaping Spencer Mansion wasn't the end. In fact, it was just the beginning. Chris walked away from that night with deep scars, and not just physical ones. Wesker's betrayal burned deep and turned his hatred for Umbrella into an obsession. It made him realize that this was just one small pawn in a much bigger game. Later, Redfield, Valentine, Burton, and Rebecca Chambers made multiple attempts to report Umbrella to the authorities, but how could they when the chief of police himself was corrupt and wanted to shut S.T.A.R.S down entirely? Chris, nonetheless, obtained information on the G-Virus and, suspecting foul play, asked the FBI to handle the investigation further. Even though he left Raccoon City behind, Umbrella was still out there, being a global threat, and Chris Redfield was just getting started. Resident Evil Code Veronica 2000. Chris had barely caught his breath after the Spencer Mansion nightmare when he got news that his sister was missing. Claire Redfield was the only family he had left, and she'd gone looking for him after the Raccoon City disaster, where the city was overwhelmed by zombies and then nuked by the American government. Claire managed to survive this, but she was captured by Umbrella's security division in France and thrown in jail on Rockford Island. Everything seemed uncertain, but one thing was for sure. If Claire was in trouble, Chris would get her out of it. By the time Chris arrived at Rockford Island, the place was already a war zone. A viral outbreak had turned the island into yet another zombie-infested nightmare, and Umbrella's private military force had been wiped out. Claire used the chaos as an excuse to break free from the prison with the help of a security guard, but Chris was still stuck in a ruined facility that was crawling with monsters. But as Chris searched for his sister, he ran into a much bigger problem. He was reunited with his arch-nemesis, Albert Wesker, who wasn't just alive, by the way, he was something else entirely. You see, back at the Spencer mansion, this evil genius had managed to infect himself with the prototype virus, turning him into a mutant with regenerative abilities. The man Chris once knew was faster, stronger, and almost unstoppable. This power-hungry traitor had now turned into an undefeatable weapon with only one goal in mind: to make Chris Redfield suffer. But Chris wasn't about to back down. If Wesker wanted a fight, he was damn well gonna get one. Chris followed the trail of destruction to Umbrella's Antarctic base, where Claire had ended up. This facility wasn't just another Umbrella lab, it was the home of the Ashford family, which was one of the twisted dynasties that had shaped Umbrella from the shadows. Here, Chris finally reunited with Claire and was pleased to see that she was still standing and fighting after everything she'd been through, but there was one last nightmare waiting for them: Alexia Ashford. You see, Alexia was beyond human. She infected herself with the T. Veronica virus, which is basically a bioweapon that turned her into something far worse than even the Tyrant. To put it this way, she was intelligent, powerful, and completely insane. And that's not even an understatement. The girl commanded swarms of fire-spewing creatures, and when shot at, her body mutated beyond recognition. At one point during the fight, Alexia even left her cocoon body to transform into a dragonfly. I mean, what's wrong with staying a human? But I suppose if you're facing Chris Redfield, one must go beyond human limits. Needless to say, that didn't stop Chris from putting her down. The fight against Alexia was one of the toughest battles Chris had ever faced, but our boy is a survivor, and just like that, yet another of Umbrella's twisted experiments was erased from existence. But there wasn't time to celebrate. When the base began to crumble, Redfield chased after Wesker, who had kidnapped Claire and taken her hostage. Chris convinced him to give her up by challenging his ego. He insisted that if Wesker was really looking for a real fight, he should focus on Chris instead, and Wesker didn't argue. For him, killing Chris would be far more satisfying than finishing whatever mission he had started. They went at each other, but he was forced to retreat before Wesker could finish him off. You see, the facility was going up in flames, and Wesker realized he had bigger problems. He had the virus, and that was more important than killing Chris right then and there. Chris and Claire also needed to get the hell out of there, so as Chris and Claire escaped into the night, one thing was clear: Umbrella wasn't finished yet, and neither was Albert Wesker. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles, 2007. By 2003, Chris Redfield had been fighting Umbrella for almost a decade. He had survived the horrors of the Spencer Mansion and barely made it through the twisted nightmares of Rockford Island, but despite everything, despite all the battles and all the sacrifices, Umbrella was still standing. And that was concerning. Even if they weren't as powerful as they once were, they were still out there pulling strings and using their wealth to keep themselves afloat. Chris knew that the world would never be safe as long as Umbrella existed. Their bioweapons had already cost too many lives. He'd lost friends, watched cities fall, and seen innocent people turned into monsters. He wasn't going to let it happen again. That's why this mission was personal. Chris and his longtime ally, Jill Valentine, were sent to Russia for one final mission to assault Umbrella's last major facility. This wasn't just another secret lab, it was their final stronghold, the last major base where they stored classified data and hid some of their most dangerous creations. If Chris and Jill could destroy it, they could finally bring Umbrella down for good, but they knew it wasn't going to be that easy. From the moment they arrived, the facility was a war zone. As expected, Umbrella wasn't going down without a fight. The base was swarming with some really horrific creatures that Umbrella had created over the years. The first wave they encountered was a horde of hunters. These reptilian killing machines were fast, strong, and deadly. They leaped at Chris and Jill with razor-sharp claws, trying to tear them apart, but this wasn't the first time. It was easy for them to defeat them, thanks to years of experience and teamwork. Next, they faced mutated creatures lurking in the dark and experimental weapons that had never been released to the world. Some were grotesque, with limbs twisted into unnatural forms. Others were massive, armored monstrosities built for war. And then there were the Tyrants, Umbrella's signature weapon. Their sheer strength was enough to rip a person in half, but Chris and Jill were experts. It didn't take more than a few precise shots for them to defeat these monsters. This would have been the end, but it was almost as if Umbrella wasn't ready to back down just yet. As they neared the heart of the facility, they came face to face with the man in charge, Sergei Vladimir. Sergei wasn't just another Umbrella executive. He had been with the company since the beginning and was now a high-ranking officer who believed in its mission. Unlike Wesker, who had betrayed Umbrella to pursue his own goals, Sergei was loyal to the end. He saw Chris and Jill as nothing more than pests who were trying to destroy years of hard work, but Sergei wasn't going to just stand there and let them win, and apparently, since no one can fight with Chris without injecting themselves, he followed suit and injected himself with the T-virus. Thus, Sergei transformed into a massive, grotesque creature with an expanded body and inhumane strength. He was a bioweapon now, and perhaps the last obstacle between Chris, Jill, and Umbrella's ultimate destruction. Sergei's mutated form was incredibly powerful, shrugging off gunfire and attacking with devastating force. Every blow he landed shook the ground to remind them that Umbrella's creations were not to be underestimated. But Chris and Jill had come too far to stop now. They fought back with everything they had and dodged his attacks. In the end, Sergei fell, just like every other monster Umbrella had created. But the mission wasn't over yet. With Sergei dead, Chris and Jill reached the facility's mainframe. This was it, the heart of Umbrella's secrets. Decades of illegal experiments, classified reports, and data on all their crazy, monstrous inventions. It was all stored here. If they erased it, Umbrella's legacy would be gone forever, but Chris had no reason to hesitate. He activated the system without a second thought. It all may seem too perfect, but it certainly wasn't. Someone already stepped in before he could destroy everything, and that someone was none other than Albert Wesker, who had been watching them from the shadows, waiting for his moment. While Chris and Jill were focused on destroying the data, Wesker had a different plan. Like we said earlier, he wasn't a loyal employee who was trying to save Umbrella's research, he wanted to steal it, and this was the perfect opportunity. As explosions shook the facility, Wesker secured all the data he needed. He knew that Umbrella was finished, but that didn't mean bioweapons were gone. With that research in his hands, he could continue his own plans and create a new form of Umbrella Corporation. As Chris and Jill made their escape, watching the facility collapse behind them, they knew that this was only the beginning of another fight, because even if Umbrella was gone, the nightmares they unleashed weren't so easily erased. Chris had dedicated his life to fighting bioterrorism, but he knew that as long as people like Wesker existed, this war wasn't over. During a mission in 2006, Chris and Jill were sent to apprehend Albert Wesker at Spencer's estate. However, Wesker was far too powerful, easily overpowering them both. In one of his weaker moments, Chris was about to be killed by Wesker, but in the heat of the fight, Jill made a desperate move and tackled Wesker out of a window, sending both of them tumbling off a cliff. Chris couldn't help but watch his partner fall to her death. After extensive investigations for 3 months, she was officially declared dead by the BSAA. This loss devastated Chris, driving him to throw himself deeper into his work with the organization. In fact, for the next 3 years, he went to every mission available with the hopes of finding her whereabouts since her body was never really discovered. Resident Evil 5, 2009. By this point, Chris Redfield was no stranger to the horrors of bioterrorism. It had been years since the fall of Umbrella, and yet its legacy continued to spread like an infection. By now, Chris had risen through the ranks as a major agent of the BSAA and was leading the charge against this global war. His next mission was to investigate a deadly new bioorganic weapon in Africa. What he didn't know was that this mission would unearth some old enemies, lost friends, and the ghosts that had haunted him for years. Chris is sent to the fictional region of Kijuju to investigate reports of a new parasitic threat, the Ouroboros virus. Unlike previous viral outbreaks, this wasn't just about some zombies. This virus infected people and turned them into hyper-aggressive Majini. Chris wasn't alone in this fight, though. We see Shiva Alamar, who was his new BSAA partner, accompanying him on this mission. Shiva was skilled, sharp, and knew the region like the back of her hand. If Chris was the brute force of this operation, Shiva was the tactical edge, and together they were tasked with stopping an arms dealer named Ricardo Irving, who was smuggling bioweapons. But soon, they figured out that someone else was pulling the strings all along. After some digging, Chris uncovered classified BSAA files hinting at Jill's survival. He didn't really believe it at first, but the evidence was there. Chris now had a new mission: find Jill Valentine and bring her home. Of course, no Chris Redfield story would be complete without Albert Wesker, the ultimate thorn in his side, and sure enough, he had to be alive if Jill was. Now injected with a variant of the progenitor virus, Wesker had turned himself into a genetic superhuman. His speed, strength, and reflexes were beyond anything Chris had ever faced, and to make things worse, he had Jill under his control. But she wasn't the Jill she used to be anymore. She'd been brainwashed and turned into Wesker's puppet, thus making her fight against Chris. The moment Chris saw her, all the pain and guilt he had buried for years came rushing back. All he could think of was how he had failed her once, but he sure as hell wasn't going to let it happen again. Chris and Shiva fought tooth and nail through the infected ruins of Kijuju, and eventually faced Albert Wesker in his lair. With Jill freed from his control, the mission shifted to one final goal: ending Albert Wesker once and for all. The final showdown took place on a volcanic island because, of course, it had to be epic. This is Resident Evil after all. Wesker, now fully mutated by the Ouroboros virus, was an unrecognizable, monstrous force, but Chris and Shiva stood their ground and refused to let his madness continue. With a well-placed rocket launcher shot, because that's how you deal with Resident Evil villains, Chris and Shiva obliterated Wesker and finally put an end to their long-standing rivalry. With Wesker dead and the Ouroboros threat contained, Chris had finally avenged Jill and ensured that the world was safe again, at least for now. But all the scars he faced, Jill's suffering, and the friends he had lost definitely pushed him to the brink. Chris had won the war in Kijuju, but his fight was far from over because in Chris Redfield's world, bioterrorism never truly dies. It was just the end of an era, or so it may seem. Resident Evil 6, 2012. Chris Redfield's journey in Resident Evil 6 was filled with guilt, loss, and eventual redemption. By this point, it was very apparent that he was a battle-worn veteran who had spent over a decade fighting bioterrorism. But unlike previous missions, this chapter in his life begins with him at rock bottom, the one where he's lost, broken, and drowning in regret. The game opens with Chris suffering from amnesia, numbing his pain with alcohol in a bar somewhere in Eastern Europe. He isn't the sharp, mission-driven soldier we once knew, but a shadow of his former self. It seemed like he was haunted by something so traumatic that his mind forced him to forget it, and that something was a disastrous mission in Edonia 6 months prior. During a mission with his BSAA squad, they encountered a terrifying new bioweapon, the C-Virus. Like always, Chris led his team into battle, but it ended in absolute catastrophe this time. The man who once fought with his Air Force officials over the safety of his team had now ended up losing his entire squad in the mission, all because he was manipulated by a woman he believed to be Ada Wong. This shook him to his core, so much so that he was unable to bear the guilt of failing his team. Now, all he could do was vanish and abandon his responsibilities to the point of self-destruction. But there was one man who refused to let Chris waste away: Piers Nivens. Piers was his second-in-command and perhaps his most loyal soldier, and he refused to just sit there and let his captain rot in self-pity. He decided to hunt him down and remind him who he was. After all, the world still needed Chris Redfield. Begrudgingly, Chris returned to duty, but he wasn't the same. It felt like we had lost the confident, unshakable BSAA hero. When the C-Virus resurfaced in China, Chris and Piers were deployed to stop it. This mission, however, wasn't just another operation for Redfield, it was personal. Chris was still seeking vengeance for his fallen men and was determined to make Ada Wong pay for their deaths, but, sad to say, his pursuit for revenge blinded him, while also clouding his judgment. His reckless rage often overrides his tactical instincts, and for the first time, we see someone call him out for it. While Piers was always loyal, he wasn't afraid to challenge our fallen hero and remind him of his duties, because, truth be told, avenging someone's death can't overpower protecting the people who are still standing beside you. One of the most powerful moments in Resident Evil 6 comes when Chris and Piers cross paths with Leon S. Kennedy, who's another veteran from the series. Their meeting becomes nothing short of tense as Leon tries to stop Chris from blindly killing Ada. It was because he had uncovered the real reason behind the bioterror attacks. Their heated confrontation nearly turns violent, but ultimately, Chris realizes he may have been manipulated. The real culprit behind the outbreak was Derek C. Simmons, a high-ranking government official and also the engineer behind the C virus. As either party continued to battle their way through BOW-infested China, Chris slowly regained his sense of purpose. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment of Chris's story arc happens in the game's climax when Chris and Piers face off against an apocalyptic potential, Eos. The fight is absolutely brutal, and just when it seems like victory is within reach, Piers is infected with the C virus. But instead of succumbing to the mutation, he makes the unthinkable choice to inject it even further. Because of that, he could harness the virus's power in order to help Chris escape. In his final act, Piers sacrifices himself to ensure Chris survives and urges his captain to keep fighting. This pure act of self-sacrifice shakes Chris to his core. You may think that he started this mission burdened by guilt, and now he had to walk away with even more, but unlike before, he doesn't run this time. He's filled with a sense of duty and honors Piers' final wish to keep fighting, not for revenge, but for those who can't protect themselves. Needless to say, Resident Evil 6 changes Chris forever. It added a lot to his arc by making him carry the weight of everyone he's lost, but instead of letting it break him, he uses it as fuel to keep going, and perhaps that's what Piers was trying to tell him all along. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard 2017. This game took the series in a fresh direction by introducing a new protagonist, Ethan Winters. Unlike the previous heroes, Ethan wasn't a hard-fighting soldier. This poor guy was just searching for his wife, Mia, who had been missing for 3 years. Eventually, his search for her led him to a rundown plantation in Dulvey, Louisiana. Well, let's just say things turned into a waking nightmare after that. But while this story mostly focused on Ethan's struggle for survival, a familiar face showed up when it mattered most: our man, Chris Redfield. At first, Ethan had no idea why his wife suddenly disappeared and just now decided to pop up again, but hey, if your wife's calling for help, you just go. When Ethan arrived at the Baker estate, he finds Mia trapped in an old decaying house. It was kind of a miracle that she was alive, scared, but still normal. Sadly, that didn't last very long. Instead of hugging her husband, the woman decided to attack him with a terrifying strength. Like us, Ethan was confused with his wife's sudden erratic and violent behavior, but before he could fully grasp what was happening, he was knocked out of his senses and dragged into the main house by Jack Baker, the patriarch of the Baker family. Ethan quickly realized he wasn't dealing with an ordinary group of murderers. Jack, his wife Marguerite, their son Lucas, and a strange old woman all displayed inhuman regenerative abilities. They could sustain fatal injuries and extreme danger without letting out so much as a scream. How unhinged. The worst part is they wanted dear Ethan to join their twisted little family. As Ethan fought to survive, he found help from Zoe Baker, Jack's daughter, who, unlike the rest of her family, hadn't completely lost herself. She explained the truth about their condition, which was basically caused by a bioweapon named Eveline. Now, Eveline was an artificially engineered little girl designed to infect and control people, thus turning them into her so-called family. Mia had been one of Eveline's caretakers on a transport ship before everything went wrong, but when the ship crashed near the Baker plantation, sneaky little Eveline escaped and infected the whole family by warping their minds and bodies. Mia, too, had been under her influence, which now explains her earlier behavior. Ethan's goal became clear: find a cure, save his wife, and get the hell out of there. After fighting his way through the estate, the abandoned ship, and the surrounding swamp, Ethan confronts Eveline. As it turns out, that scheming little chump was the weird old woman in the house, hiding in plain sight all along. With no other choice, Ethan injected her with a powerful serum, which kind of forced her out into her true form. It was clear she wanted to kill him, but just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a helicopter arrived, and thus came in Chris Redfield. He didn't steal Ethan's thunder, though. He was simply there to toss him the special weapon needed to finish the job. They took Eveline down for good, but something was different about Chris this time. His helicopter had the logo of a blue umbrella, a supposedly reformed version of the Umbrella Corporation. What? More on that later. Chris's involvement didn't end there. In the Not a Hero DLC, players step into his shoes as he pursues the last major threat, Lucas Baker. Unlike the rest of his family, Lucas wasn't fully under Evelyn's control. He was secretly working with a shadowy group called the Connections, which conducted gruesome experiments to develop more advanced bioweapons. Chris tracked Lucas through underground mines and dodged some real deadly traps. Now, Lucas was no less than a sadistic trickster, but Chris wasn't about to let him escape. After a brutal final battle, Chris put him down for good and eliminated the last major threat from the Baker estate. Now, even though we know that he wasn't the main hero in Resident Evil 7, his role was way more than just a cameo. It was a turning point. His affiliation with Blue Umbrella definitely raised questions, but was he really working for them? Or was it just another uneasy alliance in the never-ending war against bioterrorism? A deep contrast is also very evident between the two protagonists. While Chris had always been a hardened soldier, Ethan was just an ordinary guy thrown into a nightmare. Yet, by the end of it all, Ethan had proven himself. Ultimately, Chris saving him wasn't just about rescue, it was a sign that the fight against bioweapons was changing. There would always be another threat, another monster lurking in the shadows. But as long as there was Chris Redfield, there was hope the nightmare could end. Resident Evil Village, 2021. Chris Redfield's role in Resident Evil Village surely marks one of the most controversial moments in his journey. We realize that gone are the days when a hero charges headfirst into battle. The New Age heroes are the ones who operate in the shadows. Needless to say, it shocked us to the core, but we weren't alone. Ethan Winters was equally reeling in confusion and fury. However, as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that Chris's seemingly cold and calculated actions were born from necessity. The game begins with Ethan finally living in peace with his wife Mia and their infant daughter Rose after the traumatic events of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. But their quiet life is violently shattered one night when Chris and his team storm their home. In an unthinkable move, Chris guns down Mia right in front of Ethan and takes Rose with him, leaving Ethan unconscious. This was betrayal of the highest order, and like Ethan, all of us just went, "What the hell was that?" Chris was supposed to be an ally, someone he could trust. However, his seemingly monstrous actions with no reason left Ethan to pick up the pieces of his life once more. Ethan's pursuit of the truth leads him to a remote European village ruled by terrifying creatures and 4 lords serving a mysterious woman named Mother Miranda. As Ethan fights his way through the village, Chris operates from the shadows, carefully monitoring the situation. It isn't until much later that we understand that the woman he shot that night wasn't Mia at all. It was Mother Miranda in disguise. Let's rewind a bit. Mother Miranda is a centuries-old bioterror mastermind who replaced Mia with a near-perfect impersonation. I mean, even her husband couldn't recognize her. Her plan was to take Rose and use her as a vessel in order to resurrect her dead daughter, but Chris had uncovered this plot before anyone. He wasn't a villain, he was the only one who understood the scope of the threat and was willing to do whatever it took to stop it, even though he unintentionally fueled Ethan's suffering by keeping him in the dark. But Chris had always been a soldier first, and this was necessary, even if it painted him as a villain. He decided to eliminate Miranda before she could enact her scheme. Still, he surely underestimated her, and his actions only delayed the inevitable. When the time came, Chris eventually told Ethan the truth and helped infiltrate Mother Miranda's military base by eliminating her forces. They uncovered the origins of the Megamycete, the fungal organism that created Evelyn, the Baker's infection, and the horrors of the village. He discovers an underground lab filled with research that traces the entire bioterror lineage back to Miranda. Turns out, she was the true architect of Umbrella's nightmare. But perhaps the most devastating moment comes when Ethan makes the ultimate sacrifice and chooses to stay behind to ensure Miranda's destruction. Now, if you know Chris, you'll know that there's one thing he hates the most, i.e., watching another innocent life slip through his fingers. In the end, he carries Rose to safety, knowing he failed to protect her father, just as he failed so many times before. Chris's role in Resident Evil Village cements his evolution. It's interesting to see his transformation from an idealistic soldier to a man burdened by impossible choices. And even though his relationship with Ethan is a tragic one, they reforged their trust in each other in the heat of battle. The game closes on Chris, weary and somber, but already focused on his next steps. He demands answers about the BSAA, who shockingly have been deploying bioweapons of their own, thus hinting at a war to come. Spinoff Appearances. Chris Redfield has made appearances in a lot of spin-offs over the years, but while these titles don't necessarily add to his core storyline, they reinforce his status as one of Capcom's most recognizable characters. Resident Evil: The Mercenaries 3D from 2011 is a fast-paced arcade-style experience where players can take control of different Resident Evil protagonists, including Chris, and put their combat skills to the test. Here, he's depicted in his Resident Evil 5 appearance, muscular, battle-hardened, and well-equipped to take on hordes of infected enemies. While there's no real story development for Chris in this game, it highlights his combat expertise and gives the players a chance to experience his brute strength and precision. Then, there's Resident Evil Resistance 2020, an asymmetrical multiplayer game where players either take on the role of a mastermind, controlling traps and monsters, or a group of survivors trying to escape. Even though Chris isn't part of the main roster, he was later introduced as an unlockable character. Though it's a fun nod to his legacy, his presence here is more of a bonus for fans than a continuation of his journey. Beyond the Resident Evil universe, Chris has also stepped into crossover territory, most notably in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. As a guest character in the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise, Chris brings his signature weapons and military combat skills into the realm of some high-speed, over-the-top fighting games. Now, facing off against superheroes like Iron Man and Wolverine may be a far cry from battling bioweapons, but his inclusion is a testament to his popularity as a video game icon. Appearance in other media. Chris Redfield has made several appearances in films and, yes, both live-action and animated. While these adaptations often take creative liberties, they highlight his role as a central figure in the Resident Evil universe. Live-action appearances. Resident Evil Afterlife 2010. Chris Redfield made his live-action debut in 2010's Resident Evil Afterlife, the fourth installment in Paul W.S. Anderson's film series, starring Milla Jovovich as Alice. Played by Wentworth Miller, this version of Chris differs significantly from his game counterpart. The movie introduces him as a prisoner in a maximum security facility in Los Angeles after being locked away by the Umbrella Corporation under false pretenses. When Alice and her group arrive at the facility, they free him, and he's immediately reunited with his sister, Claire Redfield, played by Ali Larter. She doesn't really recognize him at first due to her amnesia. While Afterlife includes nods to Chris's original backstory, like his military training and his leadership skills, his role is somewhat overshadowed by Alice, who remains the primary protagonist of the film series. His dynamic with Claire is present, but it lacks the emotional weight seen in the games. Additionally, his rivalry with Albert Wesker, the one defining aspect of his character in the game, is reduced to a brief confrontation in the film's climax. Chris, Claire, and Alice battle Wesker aboard an Umbrella aircraft, but this time Alice steals the show by delivering the final blow against him. After the introduction, Chris didn't really return in later films, which left his fate ambiguous in the live-action series. His absence in Resident Evil Retribution and Resident Evil: The Final Chapter left his fans disappointed because of the way his storyline never concluded. The film series made numerous deviations from the games, and Chris was one of the many characters who suffered from underdevelopment in this adaptation. A reboot of the live-action films, Resident Evil: Welcome to Raccoon City 2021, attempted to provide a more faithful adaptation of the game's storyline. In this film, Chris is portrayed by Robbie Amell, and the movie follows the plot of the original Resident Evil game much more closely. Here, Chris is depicted as a S.T.A.R.S officer investigating the horrors of the Spencer Mansion. While the film had a mixed reception, Amell's portrayal of Chris was appreciated for being more in sync with the character's game persona. However, due to an underwhelming box office performance, the future of this version of Chris Redfield remains uncertain. Animated films. Unlike the live-action movies, the animated Resident Evil films maintain continuity with the games and make a much more accurate representation of Chris Redfield's character. Chris first appeared in Resident Evil Degeneration in 2008. That said, it's a cameo appearance in an archival photo, as the movie focused on Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield. However, his full-fledged debut in the animated film series came in Resident Evil Damnation 2012, where he plays a supporting role. His most significant animated role came in Resident Evil Vendetta 2017, where Chris takes center stage with Leon S. Kennedy and Rebecca Chambers. In this film, He's depicted as a seasoned BSAA agent on the trail of Glenn Arias, who is a bioterrorist seeking revenge against the US government. Chris's portrayal in Vendetta is somewhat similar to his hardened demeanor in Resident Evil 6. His dynamic with Leon is also highlighted in this film, which shows that they may not agree on a few things, but that doesn't stop them from sharing a mutual respect for each other. Chris's latest animated appearance came in Resident Evil Death Island 2023, where he reunites with a dream team of Resident Evil protagonists, including Jill Valentine, Leon S. Kennedy, Claire Redfield, and Rebecca Chambers. Somewhat between Resident Evil 6 and 7, the film follows Chris and the BSAA investigating a new bioweapon outbreak in San Francisco, which leads them to Alcatraz Island. This movie finally gave fans a long-awaited reunion between Chris and Jill after years of separation due to her capture and brainwashing by Wesker in Resident Evil 5. Their interactions in Death Island show Chris's protective side because, let's be real, Jill is still on his mind. Needless to say, his significance in the Resident Evil franchise is only solidified through his presence in the movies. And even if his live-action versions haven't lived up to fan expectations, the animated films keep them happy. Personality. It's no surprise that Chris Redfield has changed throughout the series. We feel a shift in not just his character development, but also in storytelling and game design philosophy. From his early days as a resourceful S.T.A.R.S officer to becoming a veteran of global bioterrorism, Chris's transformation highlights the immense toll one has to take while battling a lifelong fight against bioorganic weapons. In the original Resident Evil 1996, Chris is portrayed as a courageous yet somewhat inexperienced S.T.A.R.S operative. He's fiercely loyal to his team and is determined to uncover the truth behind the events at the Spencer Mansion. Even though he doesn't have access to more inventory space like Jill, Chris's campaign remains more challenging to show his ability to survive under extreme conditions. The core aspect of his personality also remains intact throughout the series as we witness his bond with Rebecca Chambers and Jill Valentine. The most drastic change in Chris's personality comes in Resident Evil 5. We see that years of fighting bioterrorism have hardened him and made him more burdened by the losses of his comrades. His trauma from losing his former partner, Jill, has left him emotionally scarred, and he becomes obsessed with stopping Wesker at any cost. This version of Chris is defined as a man weighed down by survivor's guilt, but despite that, his partnership with Shiva Alomar shows that he's still capable of trust and teamwork. In Resident Evil 6, 2012, Chris is at his lowest point. The loss of his entire BSAA team in the previous mission leaves him broken and drowning in guilt. Initially suffering from amnesia due to PTSD, he isolates himself from his responsibilities and is happily consumed by his self-loathing. It is only through the unwavering loyalty of his subordinate, Piers Nivens, that Chris regains his resolve. Nothing can change you more than seeing your subordinate sacrifice himself. Chris really reevaluated his role as a leader and reaffirmed his commitment to stopping bioterrorism, no matter the personal cost. By the time we see him again in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard 2017, Chris has undergone yet another shift, and a rather shocking one. He's now working with Blue Umbrella, which is supposedly a reformed faction of the once evil corporation. Even though here he's calmer and more measured, his trust issues remain evident. His interactions with Ethan Winters are distant, reflecting his more secretive and pragmatic approach. In Resident Evil Village, this enigmatic nature is taken even further when his actions initially make him seem like an antagonist. However, as we go ahead, it becomes clear that it was a difficult choice that he had made to protect others. Appearance. Chris's physical appearance has changed drastically over the years. Resident Evil 1996 depicts him as a lean, athletic soldier with his classic green S.T.A.R.S uniform, clean-cut look. In Resident Evil Code Veronica, Chris retains his similar look but appears with a slightly more toned body. His brown military-style uniform also reflects his shift from a local police officer to a seasoned fighter. In Resident Evil 5, Chris is depicted as a very muscular man who almost has veins popping out of his arms. This drastic change surely sparked a debate among fans. There were people who liked it, but many of us thought it was a bit much. The bulkier design aligned with the more combat-heavy, action-focused gameplay of Resident Evil 5, Chris had to take on hordes of enemies and physically overpower immense BOWs. In Resident Evil 6, Chris still retains his muscular build, but his face appears more rugged and aged, probably because of his mental exhaustion. He also sports a more armored look, which fits for a soldier who's constantly on the battlefield. However, Resident Evil 7 brought yet another controversial shift. Chris appears leaner and more streamlined with a noticeably different facial structure in this one. His softer features led to fans speculating about whether he was even the same character. However, Resident Evil Village later refined his design, making him appear older and more battle-worn, but still recognizable as the same Chris Redfield. Nevertheless, Chris Redfield's journey is quite the arc, not just in terms of his personality, but also his appearance over the years. The once relatively inexperienced soldier eventually turned into a warrior, ready to fight terrorism at the drop of a hat, and one of the most iconic characters in this iconic video game franchise. Marvelous verdict! Despite the emotional trauma, his journey has been nothing short of legend. Be it his physical transformations, his emotional struggles, his intense rivalries, he's undoubtedly one of Resident Evil's most legendary and storied characters. Chris has always carried the weight of the world on his shoulders because that's who he is. A leader, a survivor, above all, a man who refuses to let evil win. That's it for our deep dive today. Let us know your favorite Chris Redfield moment in the comments down below, although beware, if you say boulder punching, we're gonna shadow ban your ass. Just kidding, but not really, but don't test us. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like and subscribe for more such breakdowns, and until next time, stay safe and stay marvelous. We'll catch you in the next one.